Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're not just looking at a stack of sources. We are, I think, running a comprehensive structural diagnostic on the machine of modern society.
That's a good way to put it. We've taken the material you provided, and it's a fascinating collision of economics, space physics, and psychological theory. And the picture it paints is, well, it's pretty stark.
It really is. Our core mission today is to confront some of these really unquestioned assumptions we have about progress.
Yeah, we're unpacking this fundamental conflict between humanity's, almost religious pursuit of infinite economic expansion.
And the non-negotiable fact that we live on a finite, closed planet.
Exactly, with limited resources and a very fragile biosphere.
So for you, the learner, we are setting out to prove a controversial point today. The idea is that the widespread anxiety, the illness, the sense of disconnection, the structural unhappiness a lot of us feel.
Right.
Our sources suggest those aren't personal failures. They're not anomalies.
No, they're the predictable, almost necessary outcomes of a structurally flawed model. A model that demands endless growth in a system that simply cannot provide it.
This deep dive really shows that because the outward frontiers are closed, ecologically, economically, and physically, the only viable direction left for human progress is, well, it's inward.
It has to be. And that means strengthening psychological well-being, repairing our relational bonds, and fundamentally redefining what prosperity even means.
Moving away from extraction and accumulation.
And toward health and connection.
The material we have is just brilliant because it draws this straight line from the macro-level constraints of, planetary physics.
All the way down to the micro-level damage of individual psychology. We had these deep dives into post-growth economics, some very sobering reality checks on the ultimate escape fantasy space colonization.
We'll definitely get to that.
And comprehensive policy solutions. Things like gross national happiness and trauma-informed governance.
And we have to start with the core tension that really defines this whole crisis. The data is clear that above a certain income level, GDP growth just stops improving human well-being.
Yeah, flatlines.
But our economic and political systems are entirely dependent on that growth for institutional stability.
We're trapped. We're in this cycle where continuing to grow makes us less happy and destabilizes the planet. But stopping growth threatens to implode the whole political order.
So let's begin where the sources dictate we should, with the hard science of scarcity. Because post-growth science has matured, right? It's moved beyond the simple, we're running out of oil critique.
Oh, absolutely. It has replaced that old resource scarcity model with something far more sophisticated and, frankly, far more urgent. Planetary boundaries.
And that's a crucial distinction, isn't it?
It is. Because planetary boundaries replace simple scarcity with the concept of a safe operating space. It's not about running out of a single resource like copper or oil.
It's about thresholds.
Exactly. It's about crossing crucial thresholds that define the stability of the entire Earth system itself. If we cross these boundaries, like, say, ocean acidification or biodiversity loss, we risk triggering large-scale, abrupt, and irreversible environmental changes.
Changes that could fundamentally threaten human civilization as we know it.
Okay, let's unpack this a little. So this means we can't just, for example, swap out fossil fuels for solar panels and then just carry on consuming at the exact same rate.
That's precisely the point. The boundaries define our planet's capacity to keep the global environment stable enough to support us. It's an engineering constraint on the whole human project.
And the sources point out that we're already breaching several of these boundaries.
Which ones?
Well, the integrity of the biosphere is a big one. That's biodiversity loss. And also the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, which are way out of whack because of industrial agriculture.
So this isn't just an environmental problem off to the side. It means we have to structurally contract our overall resource use, not just swap the inputs.
We have to. And structurally contracting resource use means fundamentally changing how high-income countries operate, which is, politically explosive.
So what are the sources saying about global responsibility here? This has to be a global issue.
Well, what's really sobering is the admission that the high-income model, the Western dream, is mathematically impossible to universalize for the rest of the world. It just can't be done.
What do you mean by that?
The projections show that low-income countries need to increase production to achieve universal social outcomes, things we take for granted, basic human needs, health, education.
Of course. But if they ramp up their resource use to get there,
then the high-income countries have to go backward on resource use for the globe to stay within that safe operating space.
So it's a zero-sum game at this point.
It's a contraction and convergence model. High-income countries must undergo a structural contraction in resource use if global convergence is ever going to happen within planetary limits. The sources are crystal clear on this. The high levels of consumption we associate with success are unsustainable and, frankly, unjust in a finite system.
We need to define sufficiency, not surplus.
That's a perfect way to phrase it.
This brings us directly to the great economic hope. The idea that we can have our cake and eat it too. I'm talking about decoupling.
Ah, yes, green growth.
The concept that suggests we can still increase GDP indefinitely while reducing our resource use at the necessary rate. Is this the escape route we're all looking for?
Well, the evidence shows it's highly problematic. The sources are extremely critical, calling it the decoupling illusion.
No, it's not working.
GDP remains firmly coupled to resource use. I mean, there's some relative decoupling. We use slightly less energy per unit of GDP than we did 50 years ago.
But no absolute decoupling.
Virtually none at the rates required to stay within the planetary boundaries. We're nowhere close.
And why is that hope constantly thwarted? You mentioned the primary mechanism that undoes any gains we make. The rebound effect.
The rebound effect is it's structurally embedded into the economy. It's not a bug, it's a feature. If you make a process or a product or a service more resource efficient, you lower its effective cost.
And when the cost goes down,
Demand inevitably increases, often completely offsetting the initial efficiency gains.
can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Think of it this way. Your new high-efficiency light bulbs save you money on your electricity bill. But instead of just saving that money, you use it to book a cheap flight across the country for a weekend getaway.
Consuming the saved resources and then some elsewhere.
You got it. It's the economic system relentlessly converting efficiency into further growth and consumption. It's literally built to prevent us from stopping.
And that's not even counting the issue of displaced consumption, is it?
Not at all. High-income economies love to tout their shift to clean service sectors, software, finance, consulting.
Knowledge economy.
But these services are propped up by incredibly complex global supply chains. They still rely heavily on imports of physical goods, which are manufactured using energy, materials, and often cheap human labor somewhere else, usually in the global south.
So our consumption hasn't vanished, it's just been outsourced. We've hidden it in the trade balance.
We are still feeding the same hungry machine. We just don't see the kitchen anymore.
Exactly. And the sources also point out that these decoupling scenarios, the ones that get us to net zero emissions, they often depend on these hypothetical, large-scale negative emissions technologies.
Right, like industrial-scale carbon capture that doesn't exist yet, at least not affordably or at scale. The sources deem these models unrealistic.
So you can reduce energy and material use, but you can never bring it to zero.
Never. Which means true, absolute decoupling sufficient for planetary health isn't practically achievable under our current growth-dependent structures.
So ecologically, the frontier is closed. Now let's pivot to the other side of this limit, the economic boundary. What is the economic pitfall of stagnation? Why does stopping growth, which is environmentally beneficial, potentially create systemic chaos?
This is where we hit the hard realities of capitalism's growth dependencies. High-income countries are already seeing structurally decreasing per capita GDP growth.
Which, as you said, environmentally is good news.
It is. But in a system that depends on continuous expansion, this stagnation poses substantial risks to institutional stability. Our political systems are literally built on the assumption that the pie will always be getting bigger.
Wait, why is the pie not getting bigger such a threat to stability? If we've achieved a high level of wealth, why can't we just hold steady?
Because of the fundamental dynamics of wealth concentration. This is captured by the highly critical concept of the RG dynamic.
Okay, break that down for us. R and G.
R stands for the rate of return on capital, basically, how fast wealth grows on its own if you invest it. And G stands for the GDP growth rate of the overall economy.
So if R is higher than G, if your capital grows faster than the overall economy, what's the consequence of that?
If GDP growth is low or zero, wealth holders accumulate a dramatically greater share of the national income. Their capital is generating more income for them than the economy is expanding for everyone else.
Which rapidly concentrates wealth at the very top.
And exacerbates inequality, leading to intense social friction.
So that means the system requires constant growth just to mask its own internal inequality crisis. Without growth, the tension just becomes intolerable.
That's precisely it. The sources highlight that historically the only times we've seen significant reductions of inequality in the 20th century were due to two extreme circumstances:
What were they?
the massive destruction of wealth during global wars, or highly aggressive redistributive policies like very high progressive taxation and strong unionization drives.
So without constant growth to, quote, lift all boats, that accumulated wealth dynamic becomes a major engine of systemic instability.
We end up needing growth, not for genuine prosperity, but just to manage the political consequences of our own economic structure.
So Earth is a closed system. It has these internal structural dependencies that create runaway inequality when growth stops. Faced with these seemingly insurmountable limits, the ultimate romantic dream is the escape hatch: space colonization.
Right.
Let's dive into the arguments championed by the mega billionaires, the Musks and Bezoses of the world.
And it's a powerful narrative, you have to admit. It offers a technological solution to what is really a moral and physical problem. It allows humanity to just bypass planetary boundaries by expanding the system infinitely outward.
Okay, let's review the pro-colonization arguments as the sources lay them out. What's the fundamental ethical claim here?
Well, Elon Musk frames it as the highest moral imperative. The argument is basically utilitarian.
Yeah.
We have to safeguard the existence of humanity and what he calls the light of consciousness against catastrophic Earth events.
Like a pandemic or an asteroid strike.
Right. If we stay on a single planet, extinction is basically guaranteed sooner or later. Therefore, becoming multiplanetary is the only way to ensure the long-term survival of our species.
It's the ultimate, incredibly expensive insurance policy against cosmic bad luck. What about the argument for just infinite expansion?
So Fred Kennedy argues that expansion is simply the next logical step for human progress. Inwardly focused civilizations, he suggests, they stagnate, they turn on themselves, and eventually they die.
While outwardly focused ones create wealth and expand.
Exactly. And Jeff Bezos adds to this with his vision that the solar system could support 1 trillion humans, which would lead to 1,000 Einsteins and 1,000 Mozarts and unlimited resources.
It's the infinite growth fantasy, just rebooted for the cosmos. A compelling vision for sure, but we have to return to the hard constraints of reality. The sources present a pretty unified counterargument. Space colonization, especially interstellar travel, is currently an economic and physical impossibility.
The scale just breaks our physics. Let's start with the nearest star, Proxima Centauri. It's 4.24 light-years away.
Which sounds close, but what does that actually mean?
To grasp the scale, think of it as 9,000 times further than the edge of our own solar system. It's a distance our current technology can barely even conceptualize crossing.
And the most prohibitive obstacle isn't even the distance itself. It's the energy problem.
Right. To accelerate just 1 ton, and that's a tiny fraction of a crewed vessel, to 1/10 the speed of light, which you would need for any kind of semi-reasonable travel time.
How much energy are we talking about?
A minimum of 450 petajoules, that's 125 terawatt hours.
That number is so abstract it's meaningless. Can you put that in perspective for us?
That energy requirement is millions of times the energy of our current vehicles. It rivals or even exceeds the annual global energy consumption of many developed nations dedicated just to accelerating 1 single ton.
Just to get it moving.
Just to get it moving. Supplying that energy, whether you generate it on board or beam it across space, represents a completely insurmountable obstacle right now. We are talking about energy generation that exists purely in theoretical physics.
So the energy required to even begin the escape makes the resource problems on Earth look minor.
Absolutely. And then you have the time problem.
Okay.
If we launched the fastest outgoing craft we have, which is Voyager 1 today, it's traveling at about 117,600 the speed of light. The crew would arrive at Proxima Centauri in 75,000 years.
75,000 years. That's longer than all of human written history. The mission is obsolete before it even launches.
Which leads directly to the logical counter-argument put forth by physicists, the weight calculation.
What's that?
It's a bit speculative, but it's mathematically sound. The argument is that if a mission can't be completed relatively quickly, say within 50 years, you should invest the resources in building a better propulsion system instead of launching.
Because a slower spacecraft launch today will inevitably be passed by a later mission sent with more advanced, faster technology.
Exactly. So the resources should be focused on earthbound technological breakthroughs, not an intergenerational suicide mission.
So interstellar escape is pure science fiction for now. What about the more near-term goal of settling Mars? That seems like it should be easier.
Even Mars hits the impossibility barrier when you look at the resources required. The concept of terraforming Mars, making it Earth-like, is, and I'm quoting the source, not feasible using present-day technology.
What would it even take?
The theoretical plan involves warming the planet over about a century and then creating breathable oxygen over 100,000 years.
100,000 years. And is there a definitive scientific roadblock to just the warming stage?
Yes, a critical one. A 2018 NASA study confirmed that the amount of co-Euros available on Mars is just insufficient to trigger the necessary greenhouse effect to warm the planet using current tech.
There's not enough gas.
Not nearly enough. The atmospheric pressure is only 0.6% that of Earth's. To survive on Mars, you'd still need to live inside heavily shielded pressurized habitats forever.
Which brings us to the biological hazards. The physical realities of what life in space would actually be like for, soft and squishy humans. It sounds utterly miserable.
It would be a constant battle against forces our bodies were not designed to handle. We're talking about severe, irreversible health problems.
Like what?
Significantly increased cancer risk from radiation exposure. The moon's surface radiation is 200 times higher than Earth's. Radiation sickness, severe muscle and bone loss due to zero gravity, cardiovascular disease, and reproductive problems or even sterility.
Not to mention the cognitive toll of isolation and confinement. That plays right back into the psychological costs we're going to discuss.
Absolutely. And then there's the material danger, like the lunar dust. It's not like talcum powder. It's composed of these tiny, electrically charged shards of silica, described by the sources as cutting like glass.
So inhaling that.
Over time, it could easily lead to chronic pulmonary diseases, including cancer. When you realize we haven't even successfully colonized the deep oceans or established self-sufficient colonies in Antarctica areas with far fewer existential challenges, the logic of jumping to Mars just collapses into a distraction.
And this isn't just a physical impossibility. It raises a significant moral and cultural problem. If this fantasy is impossible, should we even be dreaming about it?
The counter-argument is fierce on this. If humanity possesses the collective knowledge, technology, and wealth to even think about transforming an uninhabitable planet, then we certainly have the capacity and the moral responsibility to fix the problems we created on Earth first.
We should be looking inward before we look outward.
It seems like direct proof that our current priorities are misplaced.
Professor John Traffigan argues that colonization has the odor of running away from the problems we've created here.
And by exporting the idea of human exceptionalism, this belief that we are special, separate, and entitled to extract resources without consequence to other worlds, we only guarantee the repetition of the mistakes we made right here.
So the space fantasy closes the outward frontier both physically and morally. It forces us back home.
Wow. When you put the biological hazards, the energy impossibility, and that moral critique all together, it completely demolishes the utopian escape narrative.
It does. It forces us to confront that we are truly stuck here. And if we're stuck here, continuing to pursue infinite growth inside a closed system, what is the internal sickness that results from that?
This internal sickness, this structural powerlessness and anxiety, is the direct result of the system. To diagnose this, the sources turn to a classical but critically relevant concept, alienation theory. Alienation describes how the class structure of capitalist societies creates these experiences of powerlessness, estrangement, and isolation that stem directly from the exploitation of labor.
So for the person who submitted these sources, the core finding is pretty clear. That constant anxiety you feel, that feeling of powerlessness, that's not a character flaw.
No, it's the sound of the growth engine grinding against your human limits. Unhappiness is a systemic symptom.
So what's the premise here?
The premise is that humans are fundamentally productive beings. Labor is the primary expression of our agency, our way of shaping the world. Capitalism, however, commodifies this capacity into labor power, which is then sold for a wage.
And the worker is paid only enough to survive and reproduce,
enabling the capitalist to appropriate the surplus value created by the worker's effort. This appropriation, this exploitation, is the structural root of alienation.
Okay, let's detail the mechanisms of estrangement. The sources break this down into 4 distinct yet related ways the worker becomes disconnected from their own life.
The first is alienation from the product of their labor. The result of your production is immediately appropriated by the owners and transformed into capital.
And that capital then stands external to you
as an alien, unknowable, and uncontrollable force.
That's a powerful idea. The very thing you build becomes the alien force that dictates your life. I'm thinking of a software engineer spending 2 years on a new social media feature.
And then that feature becomes the mechanism for selling their own attention, promoting content that causes them anxiety, and fueling the very growth imperative they're trapped in.
It's a perfect contemporary example. The wealth you create controls you, not the other way around. What's the second form?
The second is alienation from the act of production itself. This is the lack of job autonomy, of meaningfulness, and control over work-related decision-making.
This is so palpable today, especially in the gig economy or in workplaces with intense surveillance. When a worker is managed by an algorithm that dictates their pace in every single micro task, they lose all agency over their primary activity.
When work is reduced to just following dictated motions, the primary expression of your human agency becomes meaningless drudgery. It's just a means to get a wage, not a means of self-fulfillment. And studies link this chronic lack of control and job insecurity directly to higher rates of anxiety, depression, and poor mental health outcomes.
Okay, moving on. The third form is alienation from other people. And this isn't just about being lonely, right? It's a structural separation.
Exactly. Economic activity under capitalism is mediated through abstract categories: global competition, profit margins, stock prices, rather than through direct, cooperative human relationships.
We relate to each other abstractly.
As competitors in the job market, as consumers to be targeted, or as transactional units of labor power. It substitutes direct relational bonds with an abstract and often hostile social order.
Social media is a great example of this too. It promises connection, but it mediates it through corporate platforms that are designed for extraction. It encourages transactional or performative relationships, not genuine cooperation.
And finally, you get the ultimate consequence: alienation from themselves. This is the subjective internal experience of isolation, despondency, fatalism, and powerlessness.
Which happens even as, paradoxically, humanity's collective objective social power, our technological and scientific mastery, is constantly increasing.
We are more powerful collectively than we have ever been, but we feel more powerless individually.
That structural critique is incredibly compelling, but the sources take it a critical step further by connecting these internal states directly to measurable health outcomes.
Absolutely. Alienation theory provides a really robust framework for understanding why health inequalities persist. It aligns perfectly with psychosocial explanations, the idea that inequality affects health through psychological mechanisms like chronic stress, anxiety, and depression.
But alienation theory takes this one step further. It goes upstream.
Exactly. By linking those mechanisms directly to the upstream economic and political arrangements, the class structure itself, it argues that the system predictably damages certain populations.
And this is key because it helps explain the welfare state paradox.
Tell us more about that.
Well, many developed welfare states, like in Scandinavia, have high material conditions and pretty egalitarian income distributions, yet health inequalities persist, or in some cases, even increase.
So why does a decent income floor and universal health care not solve the problem entirely?
Because social inequality concerns not just the distribution of income, but the distribution of power, recognition, and democracy. Even if your material needs are met, if you still lack a meaningful say in determining the direction of your society, your community, or your work, if you are fundamentally disempowered by the economic structure, that structural powerlessness still translates into chronic stress and poor health outcomes.
So alienation theory forces us to look beyond just material deprivation and ask, who has the right to decide? If we ignore those power dynamics, the paradox remains unsolved.
Which leads us directly to the solution. If the external system is actively making us sick, we need to completely rebuild the definition of success. We have established that the outward frontiers are closed and that the growth imperative is structurally damaging our social fabric and our mental health.
This necessitates a fundamental break, what the sources call a societal paradigm shift.
That sounds incredibly academic. An epistemological rupture? In plain language, what does that required break actually entail?
It means a total shift in how we think and what we value. We have to move away from the old paradigm on limited growth and resource exploitation towards a new architecture that's centered on ecological balance, social equity, and long-term well-being.
And this requires psychological and cultural adaptations.
A lot of them. Challenging these deeply established mental models, like the inherent value we place on perpetual accumulation or the traditional narratives of career success that demand constant outward striving.
So if GDP is the wrong metric, we need a new definition of prosperity. Our sources point to a working, real-world alternative: gross national happiness, or G&H.
Rutan's G&H concept is maybe the best example of this paradigm shift in action. It was coined back in the late 1970s, and it centered on this revolutionary idea that gross national happiness is more important than gross domestic product.
It's a holistic approach, prioritizing non-economic well-being over purely material wealth. But this isn't just a philosophical idea, right? It's a measurable framework. How is G&H structured to function as a governmental tool?
G&H is built on 9 equally weighted domains, which are designed to capture the richness of human life. These include psychological well-being, health, time use and balance, education, cultural diversity and resilience.
Okay.
Good governance, community vitality, ecological diversity and resilience, and finally, living standard. And these domains are then further broken down into 33 weighted indicators.
That's an impressive level of detail. How do they translate this into a measurable index?
They calculate the G&H index by measuring whether a person has achieved sufficiency in those 33 weighted indicators. A person is then classified as happy if they achieve sufficiency in at least 66% of the weighted conditions.
And they track different groups of happiness?
4 groups: the deeply happy, the extensively happy, the narrowly happy, and the not yet happy.
So the measurement itself dictates the policy direction. How is G&H actually utilized as a core policy instrument in Bhutan?
It's fully integrated into their governance mechanism. It allows policymakers to identify lagging domains, say a lack of community vitality or low time use and balance, and then direct targeted investment to improve those specific circumstances.
So they use it to plan.
They align all national planning through 5-year plans, using G&H indicators. And critically, every single proposed policy must pass through a G&H policy screening tool to systematically assess its likely impact on increasing or decreasing national happiness and well-being.
That forces the government to ask for every proposed law or infrastructure project. Will this actually make our citizens happier and healthier, or will it just increase our GDP?
Precisely. And the success is measurable. The 2022 G&H index results show the overall index value increased from 0.743 in 2010 to 0.781 in 2022.
And what percentage of people were classified as happy?
48.1% of Bhutanese people aged 15 and above were classified as happy, meaning they were deeply or extensively happy. And by illuminating the remaining 51.9% as not yet happy, the government knows exactly where structural intervention is required.
That is a remarkable model for redefining success. Now, for high-income countries, which have to actively contract their resource use, what specific post-growth macroeconomic policies are required to secure employment and social stability without relying on growth?
This is the hard policy switch required to manage those growth dependencies we outlined earlier. First, in labor and employment, high-income countries have to utilize the gains from technological productivity not to increase production, but to decrease working time.
Implementing working time reduction.
Right, like moving to a 4-day work week or just fewer annual hours. That maintains employment levels and stabilizes output without demanding continuous economic expansion.
So that addresses the efficiency paradox we talked about. We take the efficiency gains as leisure and quality of life rather than reinvesting them back into more growth. What about employment shifts?
You shift investment away from capital-intensive sectors like heavy manufacturing or finance and toward labor-intensive sectors.
Like what?
Like education, public health care, ecological restoration, and elderly care. These sectors employ significantly more people per unit of resource consumed, and that helps secure full employment in a context of contraction.
So we trade in machines and materials for human connection and care. That seems to address both the ecological limits and the alienation problem at the same time. What about robust safety nets to manage the instability?
Safety nets become absolutely crucial to ensuring the population thrives, not just survives, during this transition. The policies detailed include universal basic services, healthcare, education, housing, and unconditional income, or UBI, and a job guarantee.
All crucial for securing good social outcomes and preventing economic stagnation from turning into widespread social misery.
Wait, a quick point on UBI versus a job guarantee. The sources talk about both. Is one preferred in a post-growth scenario?
That's a great question. A UBI secures basic needs and gives people autonomy, which directly combats that powerlessness aspect of alienation. A job guarantee, on the other hand, offers the inherent dignity of work and addresses unemployment directly by ensuring meaningful labor.
Often in those necessary labor-intensive public sectors we just discussed.
Right. The sources suggest a mixed approach, or at least favoring policies that enhance dignity and purpose alongside security, because the structural damage of alienation goes way beyond just income.
Got it. And to combat that RG dynamic, where wealth accumulates faster than the economy grows, What policy levers are needed for radical redistribution?
You need powerful tools to prevent that inequality accumulation, which could otherwise destabilize a zero-growth economy. And these policies are highly provocative. They include strong wealth taxes, significantly reducing returns to capital by promoting worker ownership and strengthening trade unions.
And even the measure of a maximum permissible income.
Wait, a maximum permissible income? That's incredibly provocative. Are the sources clear on how that wouldn't just lead to massive capital flight and underground economies?
That is the critical political hurdle, no doubt. The rationale is that in a finite system, extreme wealth accumulation is ecologically destructive and socially destabilizing. The policy would require coordinated international action and very strict enforcement.
But the necessity comes from the fact that without growth, high wealth concentration will inevitably consume the stability of the entire system.
It replaces the political function of growth, which is to appease distributional conflict, with direct structural redistribution.
And finally, the essential measurement shift. Replacing GDP entirely with well-being and sustainability indicators, much like the G&H model. That forces political action toward that inward frontier.
Exactly. If we measure the wrong thing, we will continue to aim for the wrong goal.
So finally, let's bring this inward focus down to the human level. We need to acknowledge the structural damage that has already been done. The anxiety, the powerlessness, the isolation. This is where trauma-informed social policy comes in.
This is such a critical convergence point, linking the macroeconomic system directly to the individual. Trauma is defined broadly as experiences producing enduring emotional pain or distress, and the sources introduce the concept of structural violence.
What does that mean, structural violence?
It means that the system itself, social inequalities, economic policies, political arrangements, inflicts predictable harm on specific populations. This leads to disproportionate trauma among marginalized groups.
Can you give us a clearer example of that?
Sure. Think of mass incarceration, drug arrests, or the prevalence of intimate partner violence in communities that have been destabilized by economic disinvestment. These outcomes aren't random.
They're predictable consequences of policy decisions.
And economic structures that favor some groups over others. The trauma is inflicted not by a single act of aggression, but by the relentless pressure of the system itself.
So, if the system is structurally violent, policy has to be completely restructured to promote healing and reduce re-traumatization. The sources lay out 6 principles for trauma-informed policy. Let's focus on 2 of them, safety and empowerment.
Okay, starting with safety. In trauma-informed policy, safety means ensuring both physical and emotional safety and preventing further trauma. This means recognizing that policy itself can be a source of harm.
What does a trauma-informed shift look like in a really high-stakes policy area, like U.S. drug enforcement?
Well, historically, drug policy emphasized mandatory minimum sentencing and incarceration, often under the guise of public safety. But we know incarceration is profoundly associated with trauma and destabilization, and it disproportionately affects minority communities.
So a trauma-informed shift moves away from that.
It moves from a hardline punitive philosophy to harm reduction and recovery-oriented approaches.
This means changing actual laws, then.
Yes. Key actions include expanding access to naloxone to prevent opioid overdosing. But crucially, policy has to address the structural disparities in sentencing, like the historic difference in penalties between crack cocaine and powder cocaine,
which disproportionately targeted African American communities.
Exactly. Eliminating their sentencing standards is a massive trauma-informed policy action because it removes a source of ongoing structural violence.
It addresses the system's complicity in creating the trauma in the first place. Now let's look at the second principle, empowerment.
Empowerment involves shared power and giving the target population a strong voice in decision-making. Policymaking has to shift from being purely top-down directives to including bottom-up elements. This is absolutely essential to combating the deep sense of powerlessness that's inherent in alienation.
Can you give us a clear example of that bottom-up approach creating effective policy change?
Well, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACTUP, they popularized the slogan, "Nothing about us without us." This demand for shared power means extending decision-making ability, not just advisory roles, to those directly affected by the policy. When policymakers design interventions for vulnerable groups, the affected individuals must be at the table.
And this movement led to real systemic shifts in how the U.S. government handled the epidemic.
It absolutely did. The process for creating the United States' first national HIV/AIDS strategy included numerous community policy discussions and soliciting written recommendations from thousands of affected constituents.
And what came out of that?
It resulted in crucial policy changes, like explicit federal support for needle exchange programs, which had been advocated by the community for years but resisted by top-down government agencies. Trauma-informed policy advocates for this kind of active partnership and empowerment, ensuring policies reflect lived experience and prevent further disempowerment.
So we began this deep dive with the core crisis, the clash between the infinite growth model and the closed system of Earth. We've mapped the iron laws of ecological and economic limits. We've debunked the technological and moral fantasy of space escape.
And analyze the predictable human cost of alienation and structural illness.
The synthesis is, I think, undeniable. The outward frontier is closed. Economic expansion in our current structure is generating profound inequality and psychological distress.
Therefore, the only viable, necessary, and urgent direction for human progress is inward strengthening psychological bonds, repairing relational damage, and fundamentally redefining prosperity around health, connection, and ecological balance.
And we have the knowledge. Alienation theory diagnoses the illness of structural powerlessness. We have the alternative models. G&H provides a working framework for a redefined future. And we have the policy blueprints, post-growth economics, and trauma-informed social policy. The solution is not intellectual. It's right here in the material you provided.
The challenge, as the sources highlight, is no longer technical or intellectual. We know what to do. The challenge is political and psychological. It demands a societal paradigm shift, a profound reorientation of consciousness away from constant accumulation and extraction.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've established that good social outcomes, health, equality, well-being, can be achieved at much lower levels of energy use than we currently see in high-income countries, and that the fantasy of escape is impossible. The Western dream cannot be universalized, nor can it be sustained.
So if the systems that demand growth for stability are actively making us unwell, we need to locate where that growth imperative touches our daily lives and our internal narratives. We have to identify the habits that perpetuate this closed system crisis.
So here's the provocative thought for you to carry forward, built directly on the analysis we completed today. If current high-income levels of resource use cannot be universalized and the fantasy of escape is impossible, what specific daily habit or deeply held cultural expectation in your own life, whether it's the need for constant career progression, the expectation of perpetual novelty and consumption, or your own feeling of inadequacy when standing still, is most fundamentally dependent on the growth imperative we have just analyzed.
Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.
We'll see you next time.